Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to yield myself 5 minutes to discuss the Jobs Act.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I think we are on the verge of doing something very, very constructive in this body, something very, very constructive for our economy, for the American people, for economic growth, and for job creation. And after a Congress that has thus far been a little frustrating for the lack of progress we've made on this front, today is a very, very big day. We've got a chance to pass a bill that has passed the House overwhelmingly with a huge bipartisan majority, a bill that the President of the United States has said he will sign into law. We've got a chance to pass this, to have it signed into law, and to thereby enable small and growing businesses across America to have greater access to the capital they need to grow, to hire new workers, to help expand this economy, to really make some progress at a time when we need it badly. The bill that I'm talking about, of course, is the Jobs Act. It has passed the House 390 to 23, overwhelming majority, and it consists of a series of component measures, which I'll talk about a little bit in some detail, each of which has either passed the full House almost unanimously or at least committee by overwhelming majority. So there's very broad bipartisan support. It is important, however, to get to this point, we need to defeat the amendment offered by my friend and colleague, whom I respect a great deal, the senator from Rhode Island, who's offering an amendment that would have devastating unintended consequences, an amendment that doesn't merely weaken the progress that we're going to make with this bill, but would actually take us backwards from where we are today. And the way in which it would do that, and I doubt that this is the intent, but I am sure that this is the consequence of this amendment. If it were enacted, this amendment would cause companies that are organized as private companies, for good and sufficient reason, for many years, they choose to be private companies because it's what's best for their business, their employees, and their customers. It would force many of them to become public companies against their will, because a change in the rules, in the regulations by which we count the number of shareholders, as the amendment from the gentleman from Rhode Island, the change that it would cause would trigger this change in the status of these companies, having enormously detrimental impact on many, many companies, raising their costs of compliance dramatically, making them less profitable. I'm very concerned, for instance, among the many ways that this could happen, one could be through ESOPs, the employee stock ownership plans. I know the gentleman from Rhode Island believes that they would not trigger this. I think that it's very likely that they would. Not only would this force private companies to go public against their will, but it would discourage the creation of employee ownership in companies. And I think the last thing we want to do is discourage a very constructive way of compensating employees. So if we can defeat the Reid Amendment, then we can move on to, I think we'll have another amendment that will deal with crowdfunding. I don't know whether that passes or not, but either way, we'll be able to expand the opportunity of small companies to raise capital through crowdfunding mechanisms. And then we'll have a final passage vote on what I think might be the most pro-growth measure that this body will consider perhaps this whole year. Let me walk through a couple of specific. This is a chart that just shows a sampling of the organizations and institutions that support this bill. It's a wide range of businesses and business associations, folks that are in the business of launching new companies, of growing small companies. It's a long list. This is an incomplete subset of that list. And I think this is an important point that I want to make, and that is that there is a very, very vast range of investor protections that are completely unaddressed, completely unaffected by this legislation. The legislation is actually modest in the regulations that it changes, and the categories that it leaves in place to protect investors who are choosing to invest in companies, be they public or private, are really quite extensive. A whole range of anti-fraud provisions that remain in full force or unaffected. A full range of SEC disclosure and reporting obligations that remain entirely still in full force. Governance rules that are unaffected by any of this legislation. Proxy statements, reporting obligations. We have a very extensive body of law and regulation that very precisely controls all kinds of reporting and disclosure requirements designed to protect investors. It all stays in place. Investors will remain very well protected if this legislation is enacted. I want to touch on the three things that I think I'm most excited about, and I'll acknowledge my bias. These are three bills that I introduced with Democratic co-sponsors here in the Senate, each of which has been rolled up into this package, including, in addition to the crowdfunding piece that I alluded to earlier, and a bill introduced by Senator Thune and others that is also part of this package. One of the pieces in this jobs package that's very constructive is a bill that I introduced with Senator Tester. This is a bill that takes the existing Regulation A in the securities law, the body of law. Regulation A allows companies to issue a security in a streamlined regulatory fashion. It streamlines the process, it reduces costs somewhat, and the problem is the current limit is only $5 million, making it not very practical for the vast majority of companies. Our bill would take that limit to $50 million and make this an option to raise capital and grow a business that would be available to far more companies. A second piece that I introduced with Senator Carper, and for which I'm very grateful to Senator Carper for his work, is to lift the permissible number of shareholders that a small privately held business can have without triggering the full, very expensive and onerous SEC compliance regime. Our bill would take that from a current level of 500 up to 2,000, and there are many, many companies throughout Pennsylvania, across the country, that are successful, they're thriving, they're growing, but they've got a number of shareholders that's bumping up against that limit. They're close to 500. They need to raise capital. They don't want to go public, and they've got plenty of people who'd like to invest in their successful business so that they can grow, but they can't do it because they're so close to the threshold. We would lift that threshold to 2,000 so that they can raise more money in the private markets, which is available to them. And then finally, what is in some ways a centerpiece of this legislation in my mind, and that's a bill that I introduced with Senator Schumer, and I thank him for his work on this. This is a bill that facilitates going public. When a company reaches that point in its growth, where in order to grow further, in order to hire more workers, in order to expand, it needs to become a publicly traded company, we make it more affordable for more companies to do that so they can do it sooner, they can grow sooner, they can hire the additional workers sooner. We do it with what we call an on-ramp. It's a process by which a company, if it has less than $1 billion in sales, less than $750 million in market float, such a company would be able to do a public offering without being subject to all of the most expensive parts of the SEC regulatory regime. They would be required to comply with a big majority of all of the existing reporting requirements, but there'd be some pieces, especially Section 404B of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is extremely complex and expensive to comply with. They wouldn't have to fully comply with that for 5 years or until they reached $1 billion in sales or $750 million in market float, whichever came first. So what we're really doing with this part of the Jobs Act is we're giving small and growing companies an opportunity to grow into the ability to afford the most expensive regulation to which they would be applied. Nobody's exempted permanently. Everybody who goes public would be subject to the full panoply of regulations within 5 years or sooner if they grow faster. And it's only available to companies that have sales, as I said, less than $1 billion. But that describes a great number of companies, and I can tell you from personal experience, when a company is approaching that threshold of asking themselves, should we go public? We could grow, we could use the capital, we could deploy it to hire more workers, we could make constructive use of it. They also have to weigh the cost. And the cost of compliance right now is huge. And we have seen a huge drop-off in the number of IPOs. We've seen a huge extension in the period of time between the successful launch of a company and the moment that they do an IPO. We've seen that lengthen dramatically since we passed Sarbanes-Oxley. It's in part because it's so expensive to comply. And so what we'll be doing if we pass this legislation today, which I certainly hope we will, we'll be making it a little bit more affordable for these companies to make that decision sooner, which means hiring workers sooner, which means growing sooner, which means more growth for our economy, more opportunities for all of the people that we represent. So I am very optimistic. I'm really very pleased that we have been able to pull together such broad bipartisan support, this overwhelming vote in the House, the endorsement of the President of the United States, the support and cooperation with individual Democratic senators who've co-sponsored key pieces of this legislation. I do think it's equally important that we defeat the Reid Amendment so that we don't actually go backwards in this process and have the unintended consequence of forcing currently private companies to become public against their will, forcing them to incur all kinds of costs that are actually counterproductive. But if we can do that today, then I think we can pass this legislation. We know the President of the United States will sign it. We should do it as soon as we can. And I just want to thank all my colleagues who've played a role in advancing us to the point we're at today. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.